The night hung over the Rhineland like a sheet of black glass cracked by artillery fire. Snow fell in quiet flakes, melting on the steel helmets of women who should never have been here. Nurses, clerks, volunteers, now prisoners of a collapsing empire. The German guards barked orders that echoed through the train yard, their boots grinding cinders still hot from yesterday's bombardment. Inside the boxcars, candle stubs burned low over faces hollowed by frost and hunger. Then at dawn, the shriek of brakes, the hiss of steam, and the sudden sight that made them forget the cold. Across the tracks stood an American column, jeeps idling, flags stiff in the wind, men in olive drab looking toward them, and at the front, stepping down from a command car, was a woman, a captain, her hair tucked beneath the cap, a Colt .45 on her hip, her voice calm, decisive, commanding men twice her size. The prisoners fell silent. Some pressed their palms against the slats of the wooden car, tears cutting through soot on their cheeks. For the first time in months, they saw not despair, but the impossible, a woman giving orders in the language of freedom. The engine hissed again, as if the war itself exhaled. The frozen fields of Thuringia stretched like a dead ocean beneath a gray February sky. Stalag 9-C, once a cavalry depot, had become a sprawl of wire and timber, its barracks sinking into the mud left by retreating snow. The air smelled of smoke and unwashed bodies. Beyond the outer fence, the war was collapsing. Inside, time had stopped. Among the prisoners were more than 200 Allied women, nurses captured during the Ardennes counteroffensive, pilots from ferry commands shot down over France, resistance couriers dragged from cellars in the Low Countries. They were the forgotten shadows of a front line that recognized no gender. Their stories had traveled only as whispers through the barbed wire. Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, had been taken near Bastogne when her field hospital was overrun by Panzer Grenadiers in December '44. She remembered the cold first, the way morphine froze in the syringes, the wounded men steaming under wool blankets. When the Germans burst through, she had been at the bedside of a boy from Kentucky who couldn't feel his legs. The last thing she saw before the butt of a rifle struck her jaw was the hospital tent, collapsing in fire. Weeks later, she woke on a straw pallet inside Stalag 9-C. Her uniform was gone. In its place, the gray rags of civilian prisoners. Around her, French resistance women murmured prayers. In another corner sat Polish medical students who had served in Warsaw's underground hospitals. Hunger flattened everything, their faces, their laughter, their hope. But Roberts wrote in her mind the promise she could not put on paper: I will remember every name. Every face. Each morning the prisoners stood for appel, roll call in the snow. Guards with machine guns moved down the line, counting lips that no longer had the strength to move. They were not beaten often. There was little energy for cruelty, but starvation worked more efficiently than bullets. The daily ration was a ladle of cabbage water and a heel of bread that smelled of sawdust. They chewed slowly, imagining the texture of home. In March 1945, rumors drifted through the camp like smoke from distant fires. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. The Führer was hiding in Berlin. The guards grew nervous. Their orders were confused. Some spoke of marching the women east toward Czechoslovakia. Others whispered of surrender. At night, through cracks in the barrack walls, Robert saw the western horizon flash with artillery. The sky trembled as if the earth itself wanted to end the war. One evening, a young guard, barely 17, approached the fence where Roberts and a British nurse, Eleanor Dawson, were washing tin cups with melted snow. He stared at them for a long moment before pushing a cigarette through the wire. "Amerikaner kommen," he said quietly. "The Americans are coming." Then he vanished into the darkness. Within days, the air was alive with the roar of engines. Prisoners could feel it through the ground, a deep vibration that made dust fall from the rafters. Roberts pressed her ear to the frozen earth and heard what she thought was thunder. The next morning, the guards ordered the women to pack. Few had anything left to carry. They marched for hours under a sky split by contrails. Columns of smoke marked the towns already taken. Along the road lay wrecked vehicles, the remains of the German 6th SS Mountain Division retreating west. When a low hum grew behind them, the guards flung themselves into ditches. P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down, their wings glinting silver before releasing rockets that turned the lead truck into a plume of fire. The women dropped into the mud, covering their heads. For a heartbeat, the war touched them again. Impersonal, deafening, absolute. When the smoke cleared, 2 guards were gone and the rest had no will to continue. One threw his rifle into the ditch. Another simply sat down and began to cry. Roberts looked around at the women, faces streaked with mud and tears, and realized the impossible. They were free, though the front still lay somewhere ahead. They moved cautiously toward the nearest village, Blankenheim, its streets choked with refugees. The church steeple had been sheared off by artillery. In the square, a white flag hung from a window, fluttering against the soot. They found an abandoned farmhouse, its cellar filled with turnips and potatoes. For the first time in months, they ate until their stomachs hurt. Outside, distant gunfire rolled like surf. They didn't know whether to run toward it or away. That night, rain fell, cold and metallic. Roberts lay awake, listening to the wind hammering the shutters. She thought of her brother somewhere in the Pacific, of her mother in Wisconsin reading the casualty lists. She imagined writing a letter. "I'm alive. The war isn't over, but I am free." She whispered it into the darkness as if someone could hear. At dawn, they heard the unmistakable growl of diesel engines. Through the mist appeared a column of olive-drab vehicles, American half-tracks, their fenders splashed with mud, white stars barely visible beneath grime. Soldiers dismounted, rifles ready. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, raised a hand. "You ladies need a ride?" he called. The women stared, unable to speak. Behind him, stepping from a jeep, came Captain Rosalind Marion Pizer, commanding officer of the 669th WWII Headquarters Company, an American woman in full authority. She surveyed the scene with eyes sharpened by exhaustion and command. "Get them blankets," she ordered. "Get them coffee. And for God's sake, someone find a medic." For the former POWs, the sight was almost unreal. The Germans had told them American women existed only in factories and homes, not on battlefields. Yet here she was, giving orders to men who obeyed without hesitation. The reversal struck like lightning through the fog of captivity. Dawson whispered, "My God, she's one of us." Roberts nodded, unable to speak. The soldiers loaded the women onto trucks bound for the rear. As they moved west, they passed through towns flattened by retreating German armor. In the fields lay tanks split open like carcasses, smoke still rising from their engines. Civilians stood in doorways holding white cloths, their faces a mix of fear and relief. The women sat wrapped in blankets, watching the wreckage of a world that had tried to erase them. Captain Pizer rode with them in the lead jeep. She asked questions, names, units, dates, recording everything in a battered notebook. When she heard Roberts' story, she looked up sharply. "Your nurse corps?" she said. Roberts nodded. "Then you're not done yet. We need every hand we can get." It wasn't an order. It was an invitation back to life. That evening, they reached an American field hospital near Eisenach. Tents lined the meadow, their canvas glowing amber in lantern light. The air smelled of gasoline and antiseptic. Roberts stepped down from the truck and felt the soft earth under her boots. Around her, medics moved with quiet urgency, carrying stretchers, adjusting IVs, tending to soldiers wounded in the final push toward Leipzig. The sound of groaning engines mixed with the moans of the injured, a symphony of exhaustion and survival. Inside the surgical tent, an American nurse looked up and froze. "Mary Louise?" she whispered. It was Helen Parsons, her roommate from training at Fort Sam Houston. For a moment, the 2 women simply stared, then embraced, trembling. Around them, men on stretchers smiled weakly at the reunion. War had few miracles left, but this was one. Roberts worked through the night, bandaging wounds, assisting amputations, ignoring the pain in her own hands. When Captain Pizer passed by at dawn, she stopped. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "you don't have to prove anything." Roberts smiled through tears. "I do," she replied, "because they said we couldn't." Outside, the first light of day revealed columns of American armor rolling east. Liberation was no longer a rumor. It was a sound. The steady grind of tracks over cobblestones, the clatter of machine gun belts being fed. The women watched from the edge of the field as an entire division moved like a river of steel toward the horizon. Some saluted. Others simply wept. They knew that the world they were about to re-enter would never see them the same way again. Far ahead, in the town still under German control, other women waited behind barbed wire, not knowing that freedom was hours away, or that it would arrive wearing the face of a woman who commanded men. Morning came slowly over the Eisenach Valley, turning the mist to gold. The horizon pulsed with artillery flashes that seemed to beat in rhythm with the earth itself. For the newly freed women, sleep had been impossible. The weight of captivity still clung to them like frost. Yet outside the tent lines of the American field hospital, life stirred. Truck engines coughing awake, medics shouting roll calls, nurses wrapping their hair in scarves, streaked with dust and oil. The war was still alive, but now it breathed in a different direction. Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts stepped out into the dawn. The smell of coffee drifted through the smoke from burning fuel drums. She paused as an ambulance rolled past, a blur of red crosses and tired faces. Behind it marched a squad of the Women's Army Corps, their boots splashing through puddles, voices calm, unbroken. She had never seen anything like it. Women not behind the lines, but in command of them. Captain Rosalind Pizer stood near a folding table piled with maps and code sheets, a cigarette trembling between her fingers. Her uniform was immaculate despite the rain, the silver bars on her shoulders catching the first light. "Roberts," she called without looking up. "You're on triage today. We've got evac convoys coming in from Castle. We're short on hands." "Yes, ma'am," Roberts replied automatically. The word ma'am carried a reverence that surprised her. Not obedience, but respect. The first trucks arrived before sunrise. Inside lay men who looked twice their age, faces wrapped in gauze, boots black with blood. The nurses worked in silence, sleeves rolled to their elbows, moving from stretcher to stretcher with the precision of veterans. Roberts knelt beside a private whose lungs rattled with every breath. He tried to speak. She hushed him, pressing morphine into his arm. When she looked up, she saw Pizer on the other side of the tent helping a medic lift a body bag. Command did not shield her from the dirt. Between the chaos, the women found moments of strange serenity, the sound of a harmonica from a nearby foxhole, a cup of coffee shared beside a barrel fire, the quiet laughter of soldiers who could not believe their officers wore lipstick beneath the grime. For many of the men, it was their first time seeing American women in uniform outside of posters. They saluted awkwardly, unsure of the rules. But Pizer knew them all. "If they can bleed beside you," she told one sergeant, "they can damn well lead beside you." By late afternoon, word spread that Eisenach was secure. The 80th Infantry had pushed through the city, capturing hundreds of prisoners and liberating another camp on the outskirts. Pizer gathered her company. "We move at dusk," she announced. "We're setting up a forward aid station inside the ruins. The Luftwaffe is still taking potshots, so keep your helmets on and your heads down." Roberts climbed into the back of a half-track with the rest of the WWII convoy. The road into the city wound through fields littered with burned-out tanks. Smoke rolled like storm clouds over shattered roofs. They passed civilians emerging from cellars, their eyes hollow, holding children who stared at the American flag painted on the vehicles as if it were some miraculous bird. In the distance, the Gothic spires of Eisenach rose through haze, half crumbled but unbowed. Inside the city, rubble filled the streets. The convoy halted beside a gutted schoolhouse that would serve as the new hospital. Desks and chalkboards lay scattered among broken glass. Roberts helped clear a space for operating tables while others set up field radios in the basement. Through a shattered window, she could see the castle of Wartburg on the hill, its ancient walls scarred by shell fire. History itself seemed wounded. That night, the bombardment resumed. Shells burst beyond the river, shaking dust from the ceiling. The nurses worked by lantern light, faces ghostly pale in the flicker. Pizer moved among them like a conductor, her voice calm even when the walls trembled. "Keep going. Don't look up." A stray fragment ripped through the roof, showering sparks. Roberts flinched, but Pizer didn't move. "That one's past us," she said quietly. "The next one we'll hear before it hits." In the brief pauses between barrages, they heard another sound. Footsteps in the hallway, hesitant, dragging. Two soldiers appeared, supporting a third figure between them. She was small, wrapped in a blanket, her hair shorn unevenly. When Roberts knelt to help, she realized with shock that it was another woman. "British," one of the soldiers muttered. "We found her near the Gestapo HQ. Prisoner transport." The girl's eyes opened, glassy with fever. "Name's Claire Hayward," she whispered. "Special operations. Thought I'd never see your flag again." They laid her on a cot, and Pizer herself cleaned the wounds. The revelation rippled through the room. Another woman soldier, another ghost of a secret war. Roberts watched Pizer's face harden as she worked. We'll get you home, she promised. But even she sounded uncertain what home meant now. By dawn, the shelling stopped. Eisenach had fallen silent. Smoke hung over the rooftops like fog. The men of the 80th marched eastward, leaving behind their wounded and the women who healed them. Pizer stood outside the schoolhouse, boots deep in ash, scanning the horizon through binoculars. To the east lay Leipzig, to the north Berlin, and somewhere beyond the Soviet lines. The end was close, but no one knew what it would look like. Roberts joined her, pulling her coat tighter. "Do you ever think about after?" she asked. Pizer lowered the binoculars. "After?" She smiled faintly. "After what? After this?" "There is no after, Lieutenant." "Not yet, but when it comes, we'll still be here. Somebody has to tell them what happened." At noon, orders arrived from headquarters. Reconnaissance units had found another women's POW camp outside Merkers, hidden beneath an abandoned mine complex. Dozens of Allied prisoners, mostly French and Polish, still inside. Pizer folded the dispatch and looked at Roberts. "Looks like you and I are going underground." The convoy left within the hour. The road south twisted through forest blackened by retreating fires. They drove past bridges blown apart, towns reduced to skeletons of stone. In the back of the jeep, Roberts felt the engine's vibrations through the soles of her boots, the rhythm like a heartbeat. Every mile closer to Merkers felt like descending into the underworld of Europe's wounds. At last they reached the entrance of the mine, a yawning mouth in the hillside guarded by MPs. The air smelled of damp rock and diesel. Inside, the tunnel stretched for miles, lit by electric lamps strung along rusted rails. As they moved deeper, the walls glittered faintly. "Gold," a soldier muttered. "The Nazis hid their reserves down here." Crates stamped with swastikas lined the corridors filled with stolen currency, art and human things, jewelry, wedding rings, spectacles. The sight froze everyone, Pizer whispered. My God, they tried to bury a civilization. In a side tunnel they found the prisoners. Women wrapped in blankets stared at the approaching lights, too weak to stand. A few crawled forward, reaching out hands. Roberts knelt, speaking softly in French, offering water. The women cried silently. One of them, her hair white though she couldn't have been 30, clutched Roberts's sleeve and whispered, "Are you real?" When they brought the first group out into daylight, the reaction was the same as before. Disbelief at the sight of women in American uniform giving orders to men. A French Red Cross worker covered her face and sobbed. "Nous avons oublié comment voir cela," she said. "We forgot how to see this." As the sun set, Pizer wrote her report by flashlight on the hood of a jeep. Her handwriting was neat, measured, the tone clinical. But beneath the paper, her fingers shook. She knew what the photographs could never show. The way liberation could feel like grief. Roberts watched her silently. "You should rest," she said. "Later," Pizer answered. "There's another convoy heading north. Rumor is they found a camp called Buchenwald." For the first time since her capture, Roberts felt her stomach twist with fear. "Are we going there?" Pizer met her eyes. "If they'll let us." Night fell over the valley, broken only by the glow of campfires. Somewhere in the dark, the war continued to die, slowly, violently, refusing to end quietly. The women sat beside the jeeps, sharing a single can of peaches among them, the syrup glinting like gold in the firelight. Pizer raised her tin cup. "To those who waited," she said, "and to those who didn't." No one answered, but the silence itself was an oath. The road north from Merkers cut through a land unrecognizable even to its own people. Fields lay cratered like the surface of the moon, villages reduced to lines of chimneys standing in ash. Here and there, columns of displaced civilians trudged toward nowhere, pushing carts filled with the bones of their lives. Overhead, American reconnaissance planes carved silver arcs through a bruised sky. The war had become a wind, directionless, immense, and cold. Captain Rosalind Pizer drove at the head of the convoy, her gloved hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles whitened. The orders were simple. Rendezvous with the 6th Armored Division outside Weimar, and assist with the evacuation of newly discovered prisoners. But the rumors whispered along every checkpoint carried a different message. They said what lay ahead was not a camp. It was a wound so deep the world would never close it again. Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts sat beside her, staring at the passing ruins. She tried to imagine what could still shock men who had seen entire cities burned to dust. The closer they drew to Weimar, the quieter the road became. Even the engines seemed to lower their voices. The smell reached them first, a stench like burning oil mixed with rot. Then the fences appeared. The gates of Buchenwald rose from the forest like something not built but grown. Barbed wire spiraling around wooden towers streaked with soot. The air vibrated with flies. As the convoy halted, soldiers of the 80th Infantry stood waiting, their faces drawn and gray. One of them approached Pizer, his rifle hanging forgotten at his side. "Ma'am," he said hoarsely, "you'll want to see this yourself, but prepare yourself." They passed through the gates beneath the sign Jedem da Seine, to each his own. The phrase glared from wrought iron letters above the entrance as though mocking every breath. Inside lay silence, the kind that followed screaming. Bodies stacked like cordwood, limbs entwined, eyes staring at nothing. Prisoners still alive moved among them like ghosts, skeletal figures wrapped in striped rags. Some saluted weakly, believing the Americans were angels. Others simply collapsed, too empty even for relief. Pizer's boots crunched over gravel dusted with ash. Her throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Get the medics in here. Water, rations, blankets, everything you've got, move." The men obeyed instantly, desperate to do something, anything that wasn't just looking. Roberts followed her, forcing herself to breathe through a handkerchief soaked in disinfectant. The stench still found her lungs. They entered one of the barracks. The walls sweated moisture. The bunks were stacked 6 high, each plank supporting the weight of the dead and the nearly dead. A figure stirred beneath a blanket, so thin that the movement seemed impossible. Roberts knelt beside him. His lips moved without sound. She poured water slowly between them. He coughed once, then whispered, "Danke, Amerikanerin?" She nodded. Tears rolled down the hollow of his cheek. Outside, cameras clicked. Army photographers moved through the camp capturing evidence, each flash a stutter of guilt and fury. Pizer stopped one of them. "Make sure you show the women, too," she said quietly. "The world has to know this didn't spare anyone." And indeed, in one of the adjoining compounds they found them. Female prisoners, political captives, Jewish mothers, resistance couriers, even a handful of Polish nurses captured during the Warsaw Uprising. Their hair was gone, their eyes fever-bright, but when they saw the women in American uniform, a murmur passed through them like wind through trees. One of them began to sing in a hoarse voice, a lullaby with no words left. Roberts moved from cot to cot, dressing wounds, handing out whatever rations remained. The prisoners reached for her hands as if touching something sacred. "Eat slowly," she whispered again and again. Slowly. Around her, medics wept without shame. Men who had stormed beaches now knelt in mud and held strangers as they died. War had taught them to kill efficiently, but not to comprehend this. By afternoon, the sun burned through the haze, illuminating everything it shouldn't. Pizer stood on the roll call square beside the camp's clock tower, staring at a gallows built from fresh timber. It looked almost clean. "They built this when they knew they were losing," a soldier muttered. "Still hanging people even as the shells were falling." Pizer didn't answer. She walked to the platform, reached up and tore down the rope with her own hands. When it fell, the soldiers cheered weakly. It wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion given voice. Later, when the Red Cross trucks arrived, Pizer and Roberts helped load the weakest prisoners first. Each movement felt ritualistic, as though they were lifting the weight of an entire world's failure. One of the women, a French teacher named Adele Durand, refused to board. She clutched a small notebook against her chest. "I must stay," she insisted in broken English. "I teach again, here." Pizer knelt before her. "You've done enough teaching," she said gently. "Let us take you somewhere with sunlight." Durand's grip loosened. She stepped forward, but her eyes never left the barracks behind. At dusk, the camp commandant's office became the staging ground for reports. Tables were covered with ledgers, files, letters, all the machinery of cruelty written in perfect German script. Pizer leafed through one, her face lit by an oil lamp. "Inventory of clothing," she read aloud. 7,000 pairs of shoes. 12,000 wedding rings. Her hand trembled. This was an industry. Roberts leaned over her shoulder. "How do you even start to explain this?" "You don't," Pizer replied. "You show it. You make them look until they can't look away." That night, the officers gathered in a makeshift mess hall. just a room cleared of debris and lit by candles stuck in bottles. No one ate much. The silence was heavier than hunger. A chaplain spoke a few words about bearing witness. When he finished, Pizer rose. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "when they told me women didn't belong near the front, I believed them. I thought our war was papers and telegraphs. But today I stood where civilization ended, and I was not the only woman there." Her voice broke, but she steadied it. "When history writes about this, they'll mention generals and battles. But remember the women who walked into hell and refused to look away." Roberts lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the pines, carrying the faint echo of voices from the camp below. Songs, prayers, weeping. She thought of the women in Stalag 9C, of Claire Hayward, of the nameless faces in the mine at Merkers. She thought of Pizer, still awake somewhere, writing another report the world might not read. Sleep finally came like surrender. The following morning brought orders from higher command. The WWII detachment would remain in Weimar to coordinate medical evacuations and assist with civilian documentation. The men of the 6th Armored would push east toward Leipzig. The separation felt strange, like the tearing of fabric. Roberts watched the tanks roll away, leaving behind the women who had seen too much and still had work to do. Days blurred. Prisoners were deloused, fed, and loaded onto trains bound for France, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Every departure felt like a fragment of hope rising from the ashes. Pizer oversaw the operations tirelessly, her uniform growing grayer with dust. One evening, as the last convoy prepared to leave, Adele Duran pressed a small object into her hand. A wedding ring, bent and tarnished. "From one who lived," she said, "to one who came." Pizer held it long after the trucks disappeared down the road. When the orders finally came to withdraw, the camp had been transformed. The fences still stood, but the gates hung open. Signs marked the site in English, German, and Russian. "This is Buchenwald. Remember what was found here." Roberts and Pizer walked the perimeter one last time. "Do you think they'll believe it?" Roberts asked quietly. Pizer's eyes followed the line of wire disappearing into the forest. "They'll have to," she said, "because we saw it." As they climbed into the jeep, the sky broke open with rain, hard, cleansing, endless. It soaked their uniforms, plastered their hair, washed the dust from the ground. Pizer laughed once, softly, almost in disbelief. "Maybe that's the first honest thing this country's done in years," she murmured. Roberts smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. They drove south toward Fulda, engines hissing in the downpour, the road turning to rivers beneath them. Somewhere beyond the storm, the war's last battles were being fought. But for these women, the fighting had changed shape. It was no longer about territory or victory. It was about memory, about ensuring that the world never again forgot who had lived and who had died unseen. When the convoy stopped for the night, Pizer sat beneath a tarpaulin, writing by flashlight in her notebook. Roberts approached quietly. "What are you writing?" Pizer looked up. "Names," she said. "Every name I can remember. So none of them vanish again. Will anyone read it? Maybe not now. But someday when they ask if women were there, someone will open this book and know the answer." The rain eased to a whisper. In the distance, lightning flickered over the hills, illuminating the broken outline of a church steeple. Pizer closed the notebook and leaned back, eyes heavy. "Get some sleep, Lieutenant," she said. "Tomorrow we start finding the living again." And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the guns of Europe began to fall silent. The thunder of war faded slowly, like an echo trapped in the ruins of Europe. By May 1945, the sky above Germany belonged to silence. The fields, once churned by tanks, sprouted the first fragile blades of spring. The rivers ran swollen with melted snow and ash. And through the quiet skeleton of the Reich, the American convoys rolled east to west, carrying the wounded, the liberated, and those who had walked too long in the company of death. Captain Rosalind Pizer sat in the passenger seat of a supply truck bound for Frankfurt, her map folded uselessly on her lap. The road signs were gone, blown apart or defaced, and each turn looked the same. Gray towns, hollow-eyed survivors, crosses marking graves that had no names. She had not slept in days. Her mind replayed the faces of Buchenwald, the women who sang in whispers, the men too weak to raise their hands, the smell that clung even after soap and sunlight. Some memories refused to die quietly. Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts rode behind her in a Red Cross ambulance filled with French women rescued from the camps. She moved from cot to cot, checking pulses, adjusting blankets. The language barriers didn't matter. Care was its own tongue. One of the women, no older than 19, stared at the sky through the cracked window and murmured, "C'est fini?" Roberts didn't answer. She wanted to believe the war was over, but she had seen how its ghosts traveled, quiet, patient, unburied. When they reached Frankfurt, the city was a skeleton of glass and twisted steel. Entire blocks lay flattened, the cathedral spire a blackened tooth against the pale morning. In the shadow of that ruin, the Americans built their headquarters, a fortress of tents, telephones, and the constant clatter of typewriters recording the rebirth of a continent. Pizer and her company were stationed at a requisitioned girls' school, its classrooms turned into offices. The chalkboard still bore the last German lessons written in 1944, faint beneath layers of dust. Der Sieg wird unser sein. Victory will be ours. Now the victory had a different language. Each morning, Pizer reviewed lists of displaced persons, assigning transport, food, and housing where she could. The numbers were impossible, millions adrift, nations without borders. Yet she worked methodically, her pencil moving faster than her exhaustion. She carried the small bent wedding ring in her breast pocket. It had become her talisman, a promise to remember. Roberts had been reassigned to the Frankfurt Military Hospital. She moved through endless corridors filled with the broken and the barely living, soldiers with faces wrapped in gauze, civilians who had survived bombings, children who flinched at every sudden sound. The hospital smelled of carbolic acid and quiet despair, but at night, when the wards finally fell silent, she would walk to the rooftop and watch the city lights flicker on again, one by one, like the first heartbeat of a body returning to life. In late May, orders arrived. Captain Pizer was to accompany a delegation of American and British officers to Paris for debriefing and commendation. She read the orders twice, folded them neatly, and said nothing. When Roberts found her that evening, she was sitting on a crate in the courtyard, cigarette burning down to her fingers. "You should be happy," Roberts said gently. "You're going home." Pizer stared into the smoke. "Home," she repeated. "Do you think it's still there, the way we left it?" Roberts didn't answer. They both knew nothing would ever be the same. The journey west took them through a landscape of uneasy peace. German civilians watched from doorways as Allied convoys thundered past. Children waved timidly. Mothers clutched them close. Along the road, signs in English, Russian, and French marked new borders drawn by tired men with sharper pencils than mercy. The war was over, but the world it left behind was a jigsaw missing half its pieces. Paris in June smelled of rain and exhaust and celebration barely restrained. Flags draped every balcony. Cafes spilled laughter into the streets. Yet beneath the music, grief lingered, a ghost at every table. Pizer and Roberts stepped from the train into Gare de l'Est, uniforms creased, eyes hollow from the road. For a moment, the city seemed too alive, too bright. They had forgotten what ordinary joy looked like. At the Hôtel de Ville, a ceremony awaited them. Rows of officers, cameras flashing, speeches about courage and reconstruction. Pizer stood among them, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. When her name was called, she stepped forward and saluted. The medal hung heavy on her chest, colder than she expected. Applause echoed through the hall, polite and distant. She caught Roberts's eye in the crowd and thought, "They will never understand where we have been." That night, unable to sleep, she walked along the Seine. The river carried reflections of street lamps like threads of molten gold. A French policeman recognized her uniform and nodded respectfully. She returned the gesture but said nothing. Across the water, Notre Dame stood dark against the sky, its bells silent, its stones scarred by war. Pizer leaned on the railing and whispered, "How do you go back to being ordinary after you've commanded life and death?" The next morning, she and Roberts boarded a transport plane bound for England. Below them, the fields of France stretched in ribbons of green and brown, dotted with the wrecks of war, craters, burned tanks, the skeletons of planes that never made it home. When they landed at RAF Burtonwood, an American press officer greeted them with cameras and questions. "Captain, how does it feel to be the first woman to command a mixed unit on German soil?" he asked. Pizer forced a smile. "It feels unfinished," she said. The reporter frowned, not understanding. The story he wanted was victory. What she carried was truth. From England, they sailed on a troop ship, the SS John Ericsson, across an ocean still haunted by the memory of U-boats. The voyage took 12 days, each one measured by the slow rhythm of waves and the distant throb of the engine. The ship was crowded with men returning from hell, tanned by sun, scarred by fire, dreaming of quiet places. Roberts spent her hours tending to seasick soldiers and writing letters for those who couldn't. Pizer kept to herself, reading the same pages of a notebook until the words blurred. On the 10th night, a storm hit. Waves rose like black mountains, hurling spray over the decks. The ship rolled violently. Metal groaned like a wounded beast. In the infirmary, lamps swung on chains, throwing light across faces pale with fear. Roberts moved among them, calm and sure, her hands steady even as the floor pitched. When it was over, she found Pizer standing at the rail, soaked and shivering, watching lightning tear the horizon. "Still think we'll make it?" Roberts shouted over the wind. Pizer smiled faintly. "We've survived worse weather." At dawn, the sea calmed. The skyline of New York rose slowly from the mist, the Statue of Liberty a silhouette against the pale sun. The men cheered, hats waving, tears unashamed. For the women, the sound was softer, a sigh, a release, a disbelief that the nightmare truly had an end. As the ship docked, a brass band struck up a triumphant march and reporters crowded the pier. Flashbulbs burst like artillery. "Smile, Captain," they called. "Look this way, Lieutenant." But Pizer's gaze was fixed beyond them, at the families waiting with flowers, at the city alive and unscarred. She whispered, "They'll never know." In Washington, debriefings stretched for weeks. Committees wanted details. How many prisoners freed, how many casualties, what conditions in the camps. The women answered mechanically, their voices flat. When Pizer was asked what it felt like to command men, she replied, "It felt necessary." The stenographer paused, unsure how to type that. The war was over, but the home front still obeyed older rules. When Pizer requested to remain in active service, the board declined. "Women are needed in administration now," the colonel explained kindly. "You've done your duty." She left the room without replying. Outside, the summer air felt too bright, the laughter of office clerks too light for a world that had seen what she had. Roberts found her packing in the barracks that evening. "They said no, didn't they?" "Yes, so what now?" Pizer looked at her hands, steady, scarred, no longer the hands of a civilian. "Now we go home." Whatever that means. They parted at Union Station 2 days later. Roberts was headed west to Wisconsin, Pizer north to Boston. The platform smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. For a long moment they stood in silence. "Do you think we'll forget?" Roberts asked. Pizer shook her head. "Forgetting's a luxury, Lieutenant. We earned the burden instead." The whistle blew. They clasped hands, then stepped onto separate trains. Years later, long after the medals had tarnished and the photographs had faded to sepia, Mary Louise Roberts would sit in a small hospital in Milwaukee, teaching new nurses how to steady their hands under pressure. On her desk stood a framed picture of her unit in Eisenach, smiling through exhaustion, their faces alight with something fiercer than victory. When students asked about the woman in the center, the one with the officer's cap and the unshakable eyes, Roberts would smile. "That," she'd say, "was Captain Rosalind Pizer. She taught us what it means to stand." And in a quiet house outside Boston, Pizer herself would rise before dawn each day to write in the same notebook she had carried through the war. Page after page of names, places, fragments of memory. On the first blank page of a new volume, she wrote, "There are two kinds of courage, the kind that fires a gun and the kind that lifts another from the ashes." She closed the cover gently as if afraid the words might break. On the anniversary of the liberation of Buchenwald, she returned once, to Europe, to Germany, to the place that had shaped and scarred her. The camp was now a memorial, the barracks rebuilt as exhibits, the air unnaturally still. Tourists moved quietly among the plaques. Pizer stood by the gate and touched the iron letters cold beneath her palm. In the distance, she heard children's laughter, students on a field trip. The sound made her smile. They came to learn, she thought. Then we did not fail. She left a single flower on the ground and walked away, her shadow long against the gravel. The war had ended on paper, but in the hearts of those who survived, It never quite stopped echoing. For the women who had walked through its inferno, peace arrived not as celebration but as a question. What now? Summer of 1946. The air in America smelled of gasoline, new cars, and promises. Cities thrummed with returning soldiers, neon lights and swing music spilling from radios. Newspapers shouted of prosperity and the dawn of a new century. Yet behind the noise lingered the quiet ghosts of Europe. And in that quiet, two women carried on their private campaigns, fighting for memory, for recognition, for the right to exist in a history that preferred its heroes male and unbroken. Captain Rosalind Pizer, now honorably discharged, lived in a narrow townhouse near Boston Harbor. The brass bars of her rank rested in a box beside unpaid bills and yellowing photographs. Each morning she sat at her kitchen table with a pot of coffee gone cold, writing in longhand under the dim light. Her neighbors knew her as a reserved widow, unaware that the notebooks piling by her window contained the testimonies of hundreds of women, nurses, couriers, pilots, prisoners, whom she had tracked down across the country. She called it the women's record. No publisher wanted it. Too grim, too political, too soon. At night she would walk to the docks and watch the ships slide out toward the Atlantic, their horns deep and mournful. Sometimes when the fog rolled in thick from the sea, she imagined she could still smell Europe on the wind. Smoke, wet earth, the ghost of diesel engines. Her doctor told her she had war nerves, a polite term for nightmares that left her gasping. But she refused treatment. "I've earned the memories," she told him. "They're all that's honest." In Wisconsin, Mary Louise Roberts had built a quieter life. She married a fellow veteran, opened a small medical clinic, and filled its halls with the scent of iodine and laughter. Her hands, steady as ever, delivered babies instead of bandaging wounds. But some nights, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the whine of artillery, the rattle of stretchers across cobblestones, the voice of Captain Pizer calling orders through the smoke. She never spoke of the war to her patients. She carried it like a scar beneath her uniform white. In early 1948, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the United States Army. Inside, a single sheet. Captain Rosalind M. Pizer is to be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for exemplary leadership during the liberation of prisoners of war. Germany, 1945. The word struck Roberts like a physical blow. Posthumously. She read the line again, lips moving soundlessly. Beneath it, in typewriter black, died January 7, 1948, Boston, Massachusetts. Cause, heart failure. Roberts sat for a long time staring at the window, snow falling beyond the glass. She thought of Pizer's eyes, the sharp gray that missed nothing, that refused to look away even from horror. She thought of the promise they'd made on the train platform, to remember. And she understood suddenly that remembrance was now hers alone. She packed a suitcase that same night and boarded a train east. Boston was asleep beneath a skin of snow when she arrived. The townhouse stood quiet, its windows dark. Inside, the air smelled of paper and salt. Notebooks filled every surface, stacked on chairs, spilling from drawers. Some opened to pages written in a hand that trembled near the end. On the desk lay the final entry, dated 3 days before her death. History is not written by men or women. It is written by survivors. We were both. Roberts read until dawn, tracing every name with her fingertips. There were hundreds. French nurses from Merkers, Polish doctors from Warsaw, resistance couriers from Holland, American pilots who never came home. Between the lists were fragments of description in Pizer's sparse, disciplined prose. Her hand shook as she saluted. She was 19. The camp smelled of smoke and lilacs. They asked if we were real. When the first light crept across the pages, Roberts closed the notebook gently. Outside, the harbor ice cracked with the rising tide. She made tea, sat in silence, and understood that this was her next mission. The war might have ended, but the truth had not yet been spoken loud enough. That spring, she began to travel. To universities, veterans' halls, and small-town auditoriums, carrying a suitcase full of Pizer's notebooks. Her voice, once soft from bedside duty, grew strong behind the microphone. She told of Stalag 9C, of Eisenach, of Buchenwald. She spoke of the women who commanded, who healed, who endured. Many audiences sat in uneasy silence. Some applauded. Others whispered that she exaggerated, that women had no such place in war. Roberts didn't argue. She simply kept speaking. "You weren't there," she said once to a skeptical colonel. But she was. And I was. And that's enough. In 1950, a Boston publisher finally agreed to print a selection from Piser's writings under a modest title, Their Watch Still Stands. It sold few copies but found its way into libraries and women's colleges, where it was passed hand to hand like a secret inheritance. Years later, historians would call it one of the earliest authentic accounts of female military service in the European theater. At the time, it was simply the truth told quietly by those who refused to forget. As the decade turned, America moved on. The world rebuilt itself with new fears, atomic, cold, invisible. But for Roberts, every new uniform and parade carried the echo of the old war. She aged, as all soldiers do, with grace and a stiffness that no medicine could soften. The medals tarnished on her wall. The photographs faded. Yet each year on the anniversary of Buchenwald's liberation, she lit a candle at her clinic window and left it burning through the night. Patients would ask why. She would smile and say only, "For a friend who commanded men." In 1961, nearly 2 decades after the war, an invitation arrived from Germany. The government of the newly founded Federal Republic wished to honor Allied veterans at a commemoration in Weimar. Roberts hesitated for days. Returning felt like reopening a wound, but also like finishing a promise. She packed a single suitcase, the same one that had carried Piser's notebooks, and flew across an ocean now crossed by jetliners instead of troop ships. Weimar had changed. Cafes lined the cobbled streets. Children chased pigeons where once soldiers marched. Yet when she approached the forest road that led to Buchenwald, the wind shifted, carrying a smell she remembered too well, pine needles and rust. The gate still stood. Jedem das seine. The words no longer menaced. They waited. Roberts walked through alone. The barracks had become museums, the crematorium a memorial. Photographs lined the walls. Faces she recognized. Places she had cleaned with trembling hands. In one frame, grainy and stark, she saw herself kneeling beside a stretcher in 1945. Beside her stood Captain Piser, expression unyielding, giving orders. The caption read, "American officers at liberation, identities unrecorded." Roberts felt her throat tighten. She touched the glass gently. "Now you're recorded," she whispered. That evening, after the ceremony, she visited the old roll call square where the gallows had once stood. The rain had begun again, thin and steady, turning the gravel dark. She opened her suitcase and removed the bent wedding ring Piser had kept all her life. It glinted faintly in the gray light. She knelt, pressed it into the soil, and whispered, "We kept our watch, Captain. They remember now." For a long time she stayed there, the rain soaking her hair, the forest sighing around her. When she finally rose, the clouds parted briefly and a single shaft of sunlight touched the ground where she had knelt. She smiled through tears that felt like release. Years passed. The world changed again. New wars, new voices, new kinds of courage. But the story of the women who commanded in 1945 began to surface in classrooms, documentaries, and quiet corners of archives. Young historians quoted Their Watch Still Stands. Museums displayed photographs once forgotten in army trunks. And somewhere between footnotes and film reels, the names of Rosalind Piser and Mary Louise Roberts reappeared, not as legends, but as proof that history's heart sometimes beats in silence. In 1973, a documentary crew visited Roberts at her clinic. The interviewer asked, "Do you think women will ever be remembered as soldiers the way men are?" Roberts smiled, lines deep around her eyes. "We never wanted to be remembered as soldiers," she said. "We wanted to be remembered as witnesses. Soldiers end wars. Witnesses make sure they don't begin again." She passed away quietly 5 years later, a candle burning on the windowsill beside her bed. And so the 2 women who had walked into Buchenwald, who had commanded mercy in the face of horror, became part of the very history they once struggled to preserve. Their notebooks, preserved by students, would one day rest in the Smithsonian, pages yellowed, ink fading, but words still alive. On the first page, in Rosalind Piser's hand, an inscription remains. "If anyone asks where the women were, tell them we were everywhere they tried not to look."